16. Although he was wearing a thick winter coat and had his leather belt buckled tied around his waist to keep the warmth inside, Second Lieutenant Kuroda still felt tired and cold. The sun was shining, but it was a very cold day, the end of his 4th month in China. It had been hell. The worst, of course, was being humiliated by Lieutenant Colonel Tajima in front of his whole platoon yesterday morning. True, there was an impromptu victory celebration he, together with some of his fellow soldiers, had held last night. Although it had managed to cheer him up, the way in which it ended just dampened his spirits even more. He exhaled deeply into the cold morning air. His platoon had found a storage area in an office building which contained a large amount of canned goods and other food. What really thrilled them, though, were the few cases of aged spirits and red-colored liquor. What good fortune they were having! After having their spoils transported back to a small residential building where his platoon was camping, Kuroda decided to have a celebration. They set up a memorial tablet with the names of their fallen comrades hastily inscribed on it and surrounded with a few lighted candles, incense sticks, and offerings of water and the canned food they had just brought home. They took turns bowing at the makeshift altar, heated up the aged spirits in pots, drank, and sang old folk songs. A full cup taken of wine into the black jug, pour it into the white jug, pour it with one's lover, while taking the heart. How does it feel? Kuroda knew the sexual double entendre in the song of two lovers exchanging cups of wine. It put him in the mood, and he began to howl with everyone else with wild abandon. To a flowering cherry, the stallion, what have you tied? The horse, becoming restless, will shake off the flowers. How he would love to be that stallion now and shake off some flowers from the tree. Instead, he was stuck here in a war in a foreign country. How he missed the flowering cherry trees in his home village in Kuma County in south-central Kyushu. Would he ever be able to go back home to his aged parents and to Miyoko, his new bride? At the thought of Miyoko, Kuroda felt a rush of joy leaping from his heart into his body. Oh, Miyoko, how I miss you. The night he was to leave for China, on the days after their wedding, Miyoko didn't say a word. They had made love for a long time. He had never thought that a woman could be possessed with such passion. Now Miyoko was so different from the shy girl on their wedding night, who had seemed so shocked and so confused by it all. Now she was so attentive to his needs, his wants, in every possible way. From the way her body arched as she welcomed his embrace, to the way her hands caressed his back, to the way they moved together as one while she moaned from some place deep inside her, Kuroda knew that she was as eager to receive as she was to give. Afterwards, her eyes glistened with tears as she lay by his side. He had noticed but did not say a word or even ask why she was crying. What could he have said? What could she have said? He was to leave for China in the morning. It was not a woman's place to talk about such things anyway. Now tears welled in Kuroda's eyes. Will I ever see her again? What will happen if I end up dead in China? What would she do then? Miyoko. Oh, a Tucson and Okasan, waiting for my return each day, even though I lie rotting on the ground. The soldiers were still singing with gusto. You and I are cherry blossoms of the same year. Even if we are far apart, when our petals fall, we'll blossom again in the treetops of the capital's Yasukuni shrine. What an honor it would be if he could bloom again as a cherry blossom at the Yasukuni shrine in Tokyo. That way he would live again. That way, he would have truly honored his aged parents, his hometown, and Miyuko, of course. Yet he had hesitated, faltered, if only for a few fleeting moments early yesterday morning. He remembered clearly the many rows of Chinese prisoners with heads bowed. His hesitation had been noticed, exploited by Lieutenant Colonel Tajima in front of everyone. What could he do to undo the shame he had brought upon himself? The prisoners had sung in defiance of what? Kuroda gave the order after Tajima and Nagamoto had departed. Not a single prisoner was spared. Was the massive bloodletting enough to thoroughly purge his shame? One of his buddies from the same county, started to sing The Difficult Bride. The one gotten last night, the bride. The next day, when possessing her, does the count stink? Or hasn't it any hair? Can she not raise herself high enough? This verse threw everyone in the room into a frenzy. They all jumped up, formed a circle, as if each were holding a rope attached to a heavy log pounder held vertically, pulled and let slack alternately, and moved in a steady rhythm, hounding the refrain in chorus of the Yuno's lead. If she cannot rise high enough, a quilt underneath try to place, even if with that it is not enough. During the month of August, some chestnut birds pick up, and these under her buttocks try to place. If even that is not enough, with a frame, hoist her up. We have taken Nanking, Kuroda shouted at last. The war is over, and we'll all be home soon. The man carried on well into the night. Banzai! They all cheered, too loudly. The door to the room burst open. Captain Akiyama poked his head in and yelled in disgust. Why don't you all shut up and go to bed? Or have you schemed? The fight will continue tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. What do you think you are? They all froze in mid-song. It was as if a basin of icy water had been poured on them. Looking at the floor, they scurried to their respective corners and huddled in silence. It was no surprise then that Kuroda still felt a bit sleepy this morning when his company stopped at a compound along a main street a few kilometers into the safety zone. The compound was comprised of 3 large 2-story buildings, which were connected by a hallway and cooking area in the center quadrangle. An elementary or middle school, perhaps? Captain Akiyama barked some orders, and soldiers orderly flooded into the compound. No one could get in or out. 8 large-caliber machine guns were set up on tripods and pointed towards the building. The captains split up the company so that each platoon was responsible for searching one building. Kuroda's platoon kicked open the door to the building on the right. Right away, they found dozens of Chinese civilians huddled pathetically in several rooms on the first floor. Kuroda saw their faces twisted by shock and fear. A large room was found downstairs holding as many as 100 people. Take them down there, all of them, Captain Akiyama barked. Some of the Chinese being herded downstairs looked much older than a Tucson and Okasan. They tittered along, leaning feebly on their walking sticks. Small children shuffled quietly along. Even babies in the arms of their mothers didn't make any noise. Kuroda gave orders to separate all the young men who looked like they could be soldiers. They would be taken to a separate room for interrogation. As the young men were singled out by Kuroda's men, they howled in protest. 不是, I'm not. 不对, it's a mistake. But their protests were in vain as their bayonets pressed in closer. 你, you, Yuna would call out in Chinese, dragging a young man out from the crowd. 你过来, come over, Yuna barked again. The young Chinese men were taken to an interrogation room, about 10 at a time. They were surrounded by soldiers and searched. Any valuables or other possessions were confiscated. You are a soldier, aren't you? Yuna asked mechanically. A young Chinese man, terrified and confused, struggled to come up with an answer to try and save himself. Yuna nodded to the soldiers in the room, who promptly beat and kicked the young man. He fell to the floor, but he was held down, his arm twisted behind his back. His genitals were poked mercilessly with a stick. Held down, he squealed like a pig that had just been skewered on a spit. Some of the young men being questioned were indeed former soldiers. They were still wearing underclothing with tags bearing the name of their battalion or company. Meekly, they were herded into another holding room. Around noon, the interrogations were over. Kuroda's platoon had detained close to 300 men they suspected were soldiers. He was quite pleased when he saw that the other two platoons had rounded up only about 500 between them. 800 or 900 prisoners altogether, not an insignificant number at all. The prisoners were assembled outside the quad, where they filled it up completely. As Kuroda sat down to lunch nearby, he realized, of course, that it was not as big a number as those prisoners he encountered in the early morning hours 2 days ago when they blasted through the South City gate. There were several thousand then, just sitting there, waiting to be taken. The memory brought back the same burning sense of shame again. Kuroda had hesitated awkwardly and bungled getting all the prisoners to line up in an orderly way, leaving the door open for Tajima to exploit his inexperience by taking 9 heads right in front of him. Surely Kuroda had redeemed himself by ordering the bloodbath which followed. What a sight it had been! Kuroda had ordered his soldiers to stand at the front of each line of prisoners, and with the bayonets at the ready, they made sport of who could cut their way through an entire line of men first. Having been stabbed and slashed, the men fell, but did not die. More troops came down the line and finished them off, as well as any of those who tried to break out of their formation and flee. It was a ritualistic slaughter. There were no bullets. The men were cut to pieces, impaled, eyes skewered, abdomens sliced open, and jugular veins severed by one decisive bayonet thrust. Blood sprayed in all directions, then poured forth in a relentless crimson torrent as the bodies writhed and thrashed in the dirt before they at last lay still. It was he, Kuroda, who had given the order. Kuroda had his misgivings about the Chinese. Why don't they fight? Surely dying in battle was more honorable than being cut down like this. After lunch, Captain Akiyama relayed an order from Lieutenant Colonel Tajima. All of the suspected soldiers in the quad were to be taken to Lotus Lake and shot, their bodies dumped into the water. The prisoners were made to line up in 5 columns. Those in the 2 outmost columns were tied to each other with a downed electrical and telephone wire gathered from the street. Under Kuroda's watchful eye, this procession of prisoners, 800 to 900 strong, marched northeastward toward the Lotus Gate, which was in the opposite direction of the safety zone. The big machine guns were cleared from the quad. It had become overcast now, and the wind was blowing fiercely. These Chinese, thought Kuroda. Did they have any idea what was going to happen to them? What if they all bolted at the same time? No, Kuroda concluded. They didn't have the will left to fight. As it happened, Lotus Gate was blocked by huge piles of sandbags left behind by retreating Chinese troops. Lotus Lake was outside the gate. Now Captain Akiyama surveyed the situation. There was no way to clear away the sandbags and open the gate in time to carry out the order. Akiyama decided to dispose of the prisoners on the spot. At the foot of the tall wall on the right side of the Lotus Gate was an immense pit. It must have resulted from the digging up of dirt to fill the sandbags. While not deep, it was both long and broad. The prisoners were told to fire along the narrow strip of dirt which lay between the wall behind them and the pit in front of them. Then they were told to go down into the pit. The 8 big machine guns which had been taken from the quad were now set up opposite the wall, pointing downward into the pit. It was then that the young Chinese men suddenly awakened from their stupor. Right away, a dozen also tried to break free and run, but they were caught and stabbed immediately, then thrown into the pit. Some of the other Chinese soldiers turned to their captors and tossed their pens, cigarettes, and whatever small secret items had remained hidden somewhere in their clothes, mumbling incoherently. "Ha ha, we're getting an allowance from the Chinese," Yuna joked. "Tai chi la, too late." A man in the tied-together line clothes Kuroda tossed him his watch. How could it have escaped the early search? The watch fell to the ground at Kuroda's feet. The man looked up forlornly for a moment, then with eyes devoid of emotion plodded on, pushed down into the pit by Yuno. Another man in his 30s produced a red string from his pocket, where he seemed to cut and retouch it several times over. Then he played with a small ball, making it disappear in his mouth and reappear behind his neck over and over again. Even though his hands shook uncontrollably, the man's skills were sufficient to maintain the illusion. Kuroda and his comrades were quite amused, and they roared with laughter. As he was stepping into the pit, the magician had one more trick. He pulled out a match, then struck it against his fingernail to light. The feeble flame flickered, but as the man was preparing to bring the flame to his mouth, it was blown out by a sudden gust of wind. The man stood there, holding the smoldering match in his fingers as a feeble puff of gray smoke hung pathetically in the air in front of his face. Kuroda and his men were beside themselves with laughter and roared uncontrollably. They were sure this man would eat fire or walk into an erupting volcano if he could save his life. "Can you make yourself disappear?" Yuna taunted. The man, his face expressionless, descended into the pit. His arms were at his sides, but he did not release the match from between his fingers. All the captives were in the enormous pit now. Their eyes glanced up at the machine guns and the man standing behind them, poised at the edge of the pit. What were they thinking? Kuroda wondered. Those who get first will be the lucky ones. "Fire!" Captain Akiyama said calmly and without hesitation. Instantly, all 8 machine guns roared to life in a deafening cacophony. The men who were hit first were indeed the lucky ones. Their limp bodies were hurled aside in panic or trampled upon as the men in the pit clambered instinctively to escape certain death. Uniforms were ripped to pieces by flying bullets as blood erupted from gaping, smoking holes. Bits of burned, torn flesh, shattered skulls, and exploding brains flew into the air. The machine guns thundered on. The empty, smoking shell casings rolled about the feet of Akiyama's men as they fired, left and right, up and down. Kuroda hastily moved back, but his uniform was sticky as splashes of blood and flesh rained down. A minute later, Akiyama's voice could be heard. "Cease fire!" Acrid smoke rose up from the machine guns, and for a moment there was silence. Then they heard the ghastly moans and primal shrieks which rose from the pit, echoed along the wall, and hung in the air overhead. The machine gun operators breathed hard, but did not take their eyes away from the crosshairs in front of them. "Fire! Fire!" Akiyama ordered again, and the guns erupted to life once more. It was not until the captain had paused again after giving the order for a third time that finally there was no sound coming from the pit. They had all gone to the other world now, Kuroda thought, as he joined in to cover up the bodies with dirt. They used the shovels the Chinese soldiers had used to fill the sandbags with dirt. Kuroda had thought to point out to Akiyama that the layer of dirt covering the bodies was too thin. Once the bodies had stiffened up in the sun, they would poke through the dirt like some macabre garden. Kuroda decided to keep the thought to himself. An hour later, Kuroda's company joined the other units of the battalion and marched northward in the direction of Lower Pass Stock. Soon they came upon the smoking remnants of a burned-out 3-story building. As they drew closer, Kuroda could see that the ground was littered with the twisted, broken, and burned bodies of dozens of men. Another battalion had taken about 100 suspected Chinese soldiers up to the roof before setting the building on fire right under their feet with gasoline poured into every room. Those who did not die from the acrid smoke leapt to their deaths engulfed in flames. Kuroda suddenly felt someone staring at him. He turned his head slowly to the right and noticed Lieutenant Colonel Tajima astride a tall horse by the roadside, inspecting the procession of troops as they continued to march. Next to Tajima, atop another grand ebony horse, was another officer. He looked familiar, with a cold, piercing gaze behind a pair of gold-rimmed glasses and a small, square mustache between the nose and tightened lips. It was Brigadier General Nakamoto. The general had been there 2 days ago when Kuroda humiliated himself with his momentary hesitation. Kuroda quickened his pace to catch up with his comrades, resolving not to bring any more shame upon himself.